Before the remake, before the compilation, we knew a self-contained story called Final Fantasy VII, a genre-defining game with a definitive ending, an entirely self-sufficient expression whose universe was there one moment for us to experience and then gone the next. An echo of life, one could even say. Led by Hironobu Sakaguchi, Final Fantasy was synonymous with freestanding experiences, wholly autonomous storylines, questions asked and then answered within each adventure, and Final Fantasy VII was part of that grand tradition. Perhaps even more poignantly so, for the greatest sense of loss it left us holding, and a cliffhanger-style ending that left the naive part of our brains wanting more, even when we knew in our hearts that it was over. And we did the only thing requested of us at the end of a Final Fantasy. We let go. After Final Fantasy VII, in the way it had done so very well so many times, Final Fantasy moved on, to new ideas, to new worlds. But out of the Squaresoft and Enix merger, a new vision for Final Fantasy's future emerged. Under this new leadership, Final Fantasy VII would become a franchise of its own. Without Sakaguchi's guardianship, the world of Gaia became fertile ground for mining. A corporation wheeled out its great machinery, dredging up the last of the livestream, calling out to our Mako-infused memories. Ideas bled from waning gazers, prequels, sequels, the compilation, but whether or not Final Fantasy VII's true value had long since been drained would become the subject of debate for years to come. With each compilation title's release, it became apparent that it was impossible to match the unanimous praise the 1997 classic still enjoyed. A lot of fans would fundamentally disagree with characterization, world-building decisions, thematic execution, among other things. With the 2015 reveal of a Final Fantasy VII Remake, many were torn between excitement and apprehension, given that the creative team behind it would mainly be comprised of people responsible for many of the compilation titles. Still, fans kept that ray of hope, held it close, because the original Final Fantasy VII was a blueprint for success, and if you asked any FF7 fan what they wanted, it was just to dial the graphics up, and how hard could it be? But following Remake's extremely divisive storytelling decisions, the fandom splintered further. Wounded fans of the classic game were left with two choices: shun the remake and avoid the pain, or instead, watch it unfold and continue to talk about it. Now in 2023, the compilation of FF7 is still running into its second phase, with the remake trilogy and associated titles. Although the trilogy has an end goal, there is no telling when Square Enix will relinquish its hold on the world of FF7. As long as there is some life in the earth, maybe the machine will keep digging. We are over 25 years removed from Final Fantasy VII, and the drive to connect with its world, with its memorable characters, is as strong as ever. But a limitless world seems at odds with Sakaguchi's intended message, and indeed with the spirit of Final Fantasy. It's a strange feeling, having joined Final Fantasy near the turn of the millennium, quickly understanding what the series was, what Final Fantasy VII's self-contained expression stood for, only to now see us held in an everlasting embrace. I'd like to make sense of those feelings, but I can't do it alone. Today, I'm joined by the Hylian, a fellow content creator who is also deeply invested in the original Final Fantasy VII. Over on his channel, he's undertaking one of the most ambitious projects on Final Fantasy we've seen to date, a living legacy, a definitive historical account of FF7, covering its production, release and reception, serving as background for an in-depth critical and chronological analysis of the game, before eventually leading into 7's aftermath, with the creation of the compilation titles and the 1997 classic's immortalized state in Super Smash Bros. And who knows, maybe he'll cover Remake too. Together we'll explain what the original Final Fantasy VII means to us, how we discovered it for the first time all those years ago, what it was like growing up with Final Fantasy, our reaction to the compilation titles, our experiences playing Remake for the first time, and what the future of Final Fantasy VII holds.
Thank you, Orion. I'm honored to be here and talk about Final Fantasy VII with you.
Well, we have to begin somewhere, so let's wind the clock right back. Let's look at how we discovered Final Fantasy VII for the very first time. And to set the scene, I'd have to wind my clock right back to the early 90s. My nose pressed against the TV screen, an 8-bit Sonic burning into my retinas, a blue blur crossing a map, climbing a mountain to face his nemesis. I guess that was my first experience with a game trying to tell a story. Through the 90s, I loved games like Super Mario World or Donkey Kong Country, games with heroes, villains and an entire world at stake. Digital realms etched into cartridges and in dire need of saving. The story might only be a paragraph in a game manual, and the reward at the end of the adventure would be an ending of sorts, but it didn't matter. If there were blanks in between, my imagination quickly filled them. These games would offer up a premise, and I'd snatch it and run with it, dialing up the drama to ludicrous heights. Sonic wouldn't just lose a life. In my reality, he could really die. Bowser wouldn't just take over the Mushroom Kingdom, he'd steamroll civilization and erase Mario's bloodline. But my thirst for conflict and storytelling was likely accelerated or even complicated by the fact that I was watching movies like Aliens or Terminator from age 7. And probably as a consequence, I was mainly interested in cartoons that had heavy stakes too. Eager to find that same level of dramatic storytelling and weight in gaming, I was looking to impart what I subconsciously felt was a greater meaning, at least to me, upon these worlds. Now that's not to say I wasn't having huge fun zipping through loops or discovering Star World, and just enjoying being a kid, but there was a part of my mind looking for a totally immersive storyline I could disappear into, and I had zero awareness that there were video games achieving that even of that time. Yes, I was that child, completely oblivious to the seismic storytelling shifts happening in the RPG genre. In the mid to late 90s, the PlayStation drop-kicked through my bedroom door. Suddenly, games like Tomb Raider showed aspirations of a cinematic story, albeit stretched thin through elongated tombs and valleys. Tekken dazzled me with its opening and ending FMVs. Oddworld's Abe's Odyssey took me on a hero's journey, while Metal Gear Solid blindsided me with the infiltration mission of a lifetime. But Final Fantasy VII would become the purest form of escapism I had experienced. My imagination would surrender entirely to it. It would be the high I was searching for, the ultimate high. The kind of high I'd only experienced one time and spend my entire life trying to replicate. And it seems absolutely absurd to me now that I would have missed out on Final Fantasy VII if Micro Machines V3 had been in stock. Back in '97, I was not on the hype train waiting for 7's launch. In fact, I didn't even know the series existed. The first time I ever heard the words Final Fantasy VII, they were spoken by a friend who had heard from a friend of a friend that it was the new smash hit game. I don't know why, but I completely dismissed it. A 7th part? The only things I knew with 7 parts were Police Academy movies or bad horror films. Without knowing that each Final Fantasy was a story, wholly independent, I figured if something was 7 parts long, it had probably overstayed its welcome. Whenever I'd browse store catalogues, I'd see the box art and I'd turn the page. It meant absolutely nothing to me. I remember returning to school in January '98, after the Christmas break. A couple of kids in my class who wouldn't normally have shared a single word together, who had completely different interests in social circles, were suddenly bonding over Final Fantasy VII. I heard them talking about snowboarding, a theme park, a full world to explore. Curious, I inquired how long it takes to finish such a game, and it blew my mind when they told me it was 3 discs long, and they were both still working their way through the 2nd disc. Back then, Christmas was pretty much the only time I'd be lucky enough to get a new game. Money was tight in the family, and so Christmas kind of became a big deal. My parents had already bought me Tekken 2 in Christmas '97, and Christmas '98 was all about Tekken 3. So, regrettably now, it wasn't until January 2000, almost 3 years exactly after 7 had launched in Japan, that I finally stopped running from the game and series that would probably do more for my love of storytelling than any other media of that time, and reignite a desire to write again, a hobby I'd enjoyed as a boy that had sort of fizzled out as I got into my teens. January 2000. I guess if it wasn't then, it might have been another time. Maybe. Who can say for sure? I like to think I would have experienced a masterpiece at some point in my life, but it happened at that moment, and however late I was, I'm grateful. It was a cold winter's evening. I remember heading into the city with my brother. We had some spare cash gifted from relatives. We were going to avail of PlayStation's 2 platinum games for £30 deal, and split it right down the middle. He wanted Colin McRae Rally, and I wanted Micro Machines V3. Why? I have no idea. Well, as it turns out, they were sold out of Micro Machines. Dismayed, there was nothing else I wanted, but on the shelf, there it was, again, Final Fantasy VII, but this time in Platinum. For some reason, just the sheer size of the box for £15 represented value to me, that even if I took a gamble and I ended up hating the game, there was still value in the deal I was getting. I would persevere and teach myself to like it. I don't know if it was all those word-of-mouth comments from people that finally caught up with me, or the pressure of not being able to find a game after dragging my brother into the city, but I pulled the trigger. I remember reading the manual on the way home and discovering the character profiles, ages, date of births. I don't want to put too much of an aura around it, but even then, there was a feeling that I was late to an amazing party, but out of the kindness of their hearts, they'd kept the lights on for me. Before the bus had even reached its stop, I was starting to know the characters I would come to love. So, how about you, Hylian? What was the context surrounding your discovery of Final Fantasy VII? And how was your first experience with it?
Before I begin, I must say, it's always quite interesting to listen to people's experiences with Final Fantasy VII, especially how they first got in contact with it. Very interesting to hear your story considering how central it became to your channel. Crazy to think how close you were to not even experience it. On my end, I guess my story is similar to a lot of people of my generation coming from Nintendo-oriented communities. My first console was the Super Nintendo, where I was exposed to dozens of franchises I love to this day, from Super Mario to The Legend of Zelda. That ecosystem allowed me to get in touch with a wide array of third-party games that felt very close to the style of games I learned to associate with Nintendo. To me, the most emblematic of these franchises was Final Fantasy. The term RPG has a very nebulous definition, inconsistent in how it's understood between person to person. Considering the classic definition of the genre in the early days of video games, I remember my first RPG being The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. But when it comes to traditional turn-based RPGs, my first game was Final Fantasy VI. It blew me away on almost every level. It took storytelling to unbelievable heights, while embracing the classical roots of its peers on Nintendo's system. That was the moment I fell in love with Final Fantasy. As a result, I talked to numerous friends who were also into Super Nintendo games and learned more about the franchise, borrowing Final Fantasy IV to give it a shot, and adored it, consolidating my passion for the franchise. It was to the point that I was even exploring other Squaresoft titles, including Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana. With Final Fantasy being such a central figure in my gaming experience, and with the generation of consoles coming to an end, I was ready to get the Nintendo 64 to experience the advent of 3D gaming with my favorite franchises. Back then, we didn't have the internet to keep up with news. It was all through gaming magazines from different countries. And amidst the hype for Super Mario 64 and Zelda 64, I remember being at the edge of my seat seeing the magazines covering Final Fantasy VII for the N64. It started with the FF6 demo using Silicon graphics technology, showing the 3D camera movement for scenes of battles, something that was very exciting to see at the time. Some magazines even made the mistake of calling that demo a real glimpse at FF7 on N64. While it wasn't the case, it did serve as a premise for what we could imagine FF7 would look like on the system once it was formally announced. Afterwards, it was all rumor talk for a while before the announcement that Final Fantasy VII was landing exclusively on PlayStation. I was too young at the time to understand the reasons for the change of platform, but I can tell you it was heartbreaking to see. A lot of friends, including much older gamers I knew, were visibly shook by this change of events. In the end, this motivated me to try to get my hands on a PS1 just to play Final Fantasy VII, as it was the massive gap in the library of games I was looking forward to with the N64. Outside of the platformers, action adventures, and racing games I was playing at the time, I was enchanted by turn-based RPGs and couldn't go a whole generation without Squaresoft games. Final Fantasy VII was also just looking too good to pass on. The mid-90s was an era in which I was completely immersed in Japanese audiovisual media, including anime series exploding in popularity at the time. The visual direction FF7 was investing in leaned on that exact type of aesthetic, with Midgar's Tokyo-styled take on Fritz Lang's Metropolis and the 90s anime approach to character design brought to life by Tetsuya Nomura. So you can imagine how much FF7's visuals hooked my interest immediately. The premise and setting were also incredibly interesting from what the marketing showed. A modernized take on its predecessor's steampunk world, with a struggle involving the essence of life and an imperial force using said essence for its villainous goals. In fact, it's often understated how remarkable it was for FF7's marketing and the game's own presentation to be so clear with how the 1997 classic was the natural evolution for the series following FF6. With thematic alignments to the past already showing signs with Mako and Materia's role in the world building. The gameplay and presentation styles were also perfect translations of the 2D vision of classic Final Fantasy into 3D. Even the character design from Nomura, which was quite different from Amano's work in the Nintendo era, had its anime look possess very similar sensibilities and roots to the character sprites of old by Kazuko Shibuya. At least to me, it was pretty clear with those big eyes. They always conveyed a very anime look to the characters during gameplay. In summary, on the surface, some people would say FF7 was changing a ton of what Final Fantasy was understood as, but anyone familiar with the franchise in any significant level was seeing how much tradition it was inheriting beneath the novelty of FMV's and Nomura's character designs. It was beyond impressive to maintain those strong roots in tradition while exploring new concepts and artistic directions, all while making a transition to a new dimension, an accomplishment few series in the medium managed to achieve with the same grace. Eventually, I got to play FF7 for myself, and man, what a magical journey it was. I had already experienced by that point the novelty of 3D and the new camera work it allowed to come to life, in a manner that not even films were capable of at the time through Super Mario 64. But Final Fantasy VII took that a step further with its opening. The scope of Midgar shown through FMVs was beyond impressive, the clever focus on depth provided by the third dimension that bled through the very first shot of the playable sequence in the game, it was all phenomenal. More than just the visuals, what really blew me away was the execution of the cinematic direction in conjunction with the gameplay and music. I can't say I already fell in love with FF7 by that point because, that would be quite premature on my end. But the opening bombing mission was already a perfect entry point to this work of art. The level of maturity and subtlety in its approach to activism flew over my head as a child, but I was already moved by the shock of the suffering caused by Avalanche. The ATB gameplay with Materia was addicting, and the pre-rendered backgrounds with the polygonal characters, while some today consider to be an aged aesthetic, to me was absolutely gorgeous to look at. You had to see it with CRT TVs. The visuals were specifically crafted for that medium, where it all blends in so well. Ports released after the PS1 version lost that visual flair, so unfortunately many today don't get to experience the peak of FF7's visuals, but I can at least say from experience that playing it for the first time in the late 90s was a sight to behold. The moment I noticed I was truly falling in love with the game was when Cloud returns to 7th Heaven after the bombing mission, seeing the humanity and lightheartedness of the Avalanche trio, Marlene, and especially Tifa. The reunion with Tifa was the moment I got to see a heartfelt retelling of history for the protagonist and a supposedly dear friend to him. It's the moment I saw classical heroism strongly rooted within a complex and serious character I was following closely. The ambience of the scene with Tifa's theme touched my heart. Cloud falling into Aerith's church and later showing more of his real self on the rooftops of the slums was the moment I got hooked for good. I knew something was special with these characters and their histories. I knew I was playing something that could likely define my life in terms of artistic experience. With that said, Orion, how was your first experience with FF7? When did it first hook you and made you realize this was going to be as amazing as it ended up being? And how was the aftermath of playing Final Fantasy VII for you?
Well, I'd like to say I was as deeply culturally aware of Final Fantasy VII as you were, Hylian, and so in tune with its artistic value even before its arrival, but as you now know, I was just that kid coming home on the bus, over 2 years late to the dance. I remember arriving home quite excited to start the game, but conscious at the same time that stylistically it will be unlike anything I've yet played. On startup, I remember thinking the prelude music was quite beautiful. I let it play all the way through, and I'm not gonna lie, watching the developer names come up, that was probably the first time I realised it was a Japanese title. And again, there's no point in rewriting the past. After the opening FMV unfolded, and Cloud leapt from that train, a strange jumble of polygons, or even as I watched the characters walk in and out of Cloud like he was some sort of storage box for all their hopes and dreams, I did slightly worry that I may be coming to the game too late to fully appreciate its beauty. I'm pretty sure I took a heavy beating in the Scorpion fight, a victim of the famous translation error, and I'm also pretty sure I was a little frustrated. I persevered. I think as soon as I completed the bombing mission and was unleashed into Midgar City, a good feeling washed over me, escaping from the flames, crossing through the night, seeing the vagrants, and then the flower girl, arts, a culture, surviving amid the damage, shapes shuffling in windows, a transport network, and a deeply moving yet unsettling theme playing over it. I don't think I even noticed it happen. The jagged polygons very quickly smoothed out. The pre-rendered backgrounds became infallible representations of a living, breathing world. In short, the graphics didn't matter when the storytelling and immersion was this good. Still, quite quickly, the world became beautiful before my eyes. As I walked through Midgar, it was the first time a city had been realised for me in a video game. With just those 4 pre-rendered backgrounds that carry Cloud from the reactor fallout to the train escape, I had a far grander sense of scale than anything I'd played up to that time, and I couldn't recall an attempt at a convincing city, let alone a metropolis, somehow selling that there was miles to walk when really our road was limited. In the Mako night, the simple choice of whether or not to engage in a longer conversation with Eris, a chance encounter, then gone, something as small as that moment that made my imagination surrender to this world so lovingly created. The voice that always tried to raise the stakes was suddenly silent. I was a passenger, completely engrossed. And, Hylian, it's interesting what you said about arriving in Sector 7, because it was about that moment for me when I think I started to love the game. Oddly, it wasn't listening to the townspeople talk about the devastation the reactor bombing had caused, the hints at a great disruption and loss of life. It wasn't even reminiscing with Tifa. All of that was beautiful, yes, but for me, it was only when I booted up the game again and the prelude music played again. Something clicked. I considered the lives lost in the reactor bombing blast due to my actions, and the absolute profoundness hit me. The story was telling me we might not be perfect. That's new. But wait, it's also presenting the idea that we're not wrong either? That it's far more complicated than that? To me, the music was now filled with a deep sadness, and in my mind, it was written purely for that moral conflict. The story asked us to take on the guilt, to own up to it, to carry it like a cross, and to go on in spite of it. And there was only one road, ahead on our way. Why had nobody told me about this game? No, I mean, why didn't they really tell me how great it was? If they had, why didn't I listen? The most powerful moment I've experienced in a video game, the most stunning opening, and it was that very moment that I was hooked. I drank up every line of dialogue, consumed by the story, so much so that the battle system became my enemy. I ignored the rules, I learned only what was necessary. Barrier was a foreign word to me. I was a gung-ho, sword-wielding maniac, liable to get his ass kicked at every turn. Foolishly, I felt battles were things that got in the way of learning about the wonderful world and characters. I remember even struggling at the Genova boat fight, and, without access to the internet, having to consult a schoolmate for tips, when the only worthwhile answer was the one I didn't want to admit: level the hell up. It would only be when I arrived at the Temple of the Ancients and hit a wall, figuratively and literally, that I was forced to finally get to grips with the system. I was getting nowhere fast by skipping fights. I learned through punishment, and I came out a better player. So I can only be honest in that the things that attracted me to FF7 were the story, characters, music and world. Turn-based combat was something I came to love over time. Speaking of music, I remember thinking there's no way it can stay consistently this great throughout. On the opening credits, it says the music is written by one person. Surely their creativity will burn out like a candle. It was only when I got to Cosmo Canyon and was completely floored by that track too, I realised it's just going to be like this the whole way through. And it's moments like that why I still fondly remember that first playthrough. Final Fantasy VII was the gift that kept on giving in every aspect. Even when I walked out of Midgar for the first time, I recall asking someone in school if I was near the end of Disc 1, and they said no, you've just started. I didn't see how that was possible, but it was. And the game kept surprising me, twisting and turning, promising and delivering. And the most hilarious thing to me, and the thing I often forget, is that the same person I turned to for advice and tips in school one day just blatantly said, Eris dies soon, Sephiroth kills her. I was disappointed he'd spoiled it, but strangely, when it happened in the story, even though I knew it was coming, I was still shocked, I was still deeply moved, my blood was still boiling with the thought of revenge. And it's something I constantly forget, because even to me, a guy who had it all spoiled for him, Eris's death is that iconic gaming moment in my memory, and I knew it was coming. Funny that. And maybe it's that, and everything else I've learned about storytelling over the years, that I firmly believe it's not just what happens that's important, it's how. And maybe that's just like when I discovered Final Fantasy VII for the first time. It happened the way it happened. It wasn't important that I was late to the game. It didn't matter I'd been missing out all that time. All that mattered was that it happened then, on that winter's evening when I stopped running. My mind was ready for that kind of story, and in my life it happened at the right time to fully embrace it, because I'm not sure how in any circumstance I could have loved it more than I did. I still look back on it as the greatest experience I've ever had playing a video game, and I wouldn't change it for the world. As the end credits rolled, I was struck by the kind of emptiness one only experiences when a work of exceptional quality comes to a close. The finality weighed heavy. I had questions, but I don't think I wanted the answers. After everything I'd been through, a polygon man bounding from a train, a momentous journey, to then stand magnificently realised among friends, looking down on the earth, holding our breath, a silent prayer. The ending was brave. After all the laughter, the pain, the goosebumps, the adrenaline, it left us on the edge of a seat, punctuated by that 500 years later epilogue, and then the end screen that leads to nowhere, not even back to the main menu, so that I was forced, after a time, after staring into the void, to accept that it was over and power off my PlayStation. Gaming would never be the same, and I was dazed. But while my journey with Final Fantasy VII was over, I was blessed in that Final Fantasy VIII had already been released, so I jumped straight into that in the summer of 2000, and then only 8 months later, Final Fantasy IX had arrived in Europe. So, looking back, I was spoiled. What a time to get into the franchise. Transitioning from 7 to 8, I was happy to see that the world map, turn-based combat, and various naming conventions were present. As a new Final Fantasy player experiencing something outside 7 for the first time, these elements lent 8 a sense of comfort and familiarity, while the new systems, visual aesthetic, story and characters firmly stamped the individuality. I think it was 7's cinematic powerhouse storytelling and word-of-mouth promise of a breathtaking adventure that drew so many mainstream gamers in, but it was the accessible system that helped keep those people playing, turned novices into experts. I alluded to it earlier, but FF7 seemed to have captured the imagination of a wider spectrum. People in my school who normally would have resigned such games to geek culture and would rather have played the latest FIFA game. I think 8 probably lost a lot of those fans in the transition over to a world that offered greater realism but seemed all the stranger for it. As for me, as someone who had once stubbornly engaged with 7's battle system, refusing to learn its deeper intricacies, you can imagine how 8's junction system presented a significant hurdle to overcome, particularly after the beautiful simplicity of 7's materia system. All that said, I loved 8, I loved 9, I'd go on to love 10 also. As far as Final Fantasy VII opening my eyes to other RPGs, my knowledge of the genre was exceptionally limited. And this will tell you how naive I was. Not long after starting FF8, I remember walking into a video game store and they had Suikoden 2 set up on a games machine. That was the first time I realised that world maps and turn-based combat were a staple of a genre, not just Final Fantasy. In the early 2000s, I would eventually go on to try some other RPGs, and of course Final Fantasy's back catalogue, but it would be near impossible to top 7. Looking back through the years, there are a few milestone games that stick out to me after 7, games that truly transported me: Metal Gear Solid 2, Jak and Daxter, Halo, Half-Life 2, Shadow of the Colossus, to name a few. All are standout gaming memories for me, but none would match that feeling FF7 brought, not even the other Final Fantasy games. And as the years went on, and through my many replays of FF7, sure there were things I could find fault with, things I'd been more forgiving of as a 14-year-old, but to be great in spite of its flaws was all you could ever ask of something that couldn't be perfect. So Hylian, I really want to know how Final Fantasy VII impacted you after playing it. Did it lead you to other RPGs? And as someone who was already deeply invested in Final Fantasy, even before 7, what were your feelings surrounding the franchise, having finished 7, and then experiencing the various entries on PlayStation that came after?
Well, as soon as I finished Final Fantasy VII, I was met with a powerful philosophical reflection on whether the good in humanity, even if not expressed by its majority, can redeem humanity itself from their flaws that cause harm to individuals and the environment. That ending was extremely impactful to me, especially because of how ambiguous it all was. It made me think in a way no other ending for a video game has led me to before. Back then, there were, of course, numerous impactful works of art in my upbringing, including video games, but even as a young kid, my experience with FF7 felt deep. I kept asking myself, did the characters I grew to love survive and live happily as they rebuilt their world? Or did they, quote-unquote, live on happily in the livestream as the planet flourished again without human existence? When it comes to FF7 leading me to other RPGs, as ironic as it might sound, I can really think of only one title: Xenogears. The game's title was already featured in an important scene in Final Fantasy VII, and it was something that always intrigued my curiosity on what it meant. Once I read on magazines about a game called Xenogears having trouble over its localization due to its religious themes, I had my eye on it immediately. Over time, I got to learn more about that Squaresoft title. It appealed quite hard to the anime aesthetics of the time, it employed mechas and world building deeply rooted in the reinterpretation of Judeo-Christian iconography, and it was, from a development standpoint, directly linked to Final Fantasy VII. So yeah, while not many RPGs were discovered on my end because of FF7, my experience with Sakaguchi's 1997 classic led me to an appreciation of the Xeno series, which still lives strong today under Nintendo and Monolith Soft. In the end, FF7 solidified Final Fantasy's position as one of the 3 IPs I valued the most in the gaming medium. The explosive success of Final Fantasy VII led to numerous spin-offs for the series to come to life, so I was getting hooked even with side games like Final Fantasy Tactics and the best Mario Kart clone I've played outside of a Nintendo system. The mainline series, however, was what truly drove my anticipation for new titles moving forward. It was the main thing that kept me considering getting a PlayStation throughout the generations. The standard set by the titles up to that point was undeniably very high, making the immediate follow-ups to FF7 quite an interesting experience, to say the least. Final Fantasy VIII would eventually be revealed to the public, and I remember being shocked as I followed up on the news by some of the changes to traditional Final Fantasy presentation. It was now abandoning the chibi-like models for overworld scenes, and the aesthetics dropped the stylized anime roots of its predecessors in favor of more realistic character designs. And to be quite clear, FF8's visual style is still rooted in anime, of course, but there is a much harder appeal to anime that try to emulate realistic features, rather than something more fantastical and stylized as the visuals conveyed by the first 7 Final Fantasy titles. I know it isn't a common experience, as I've heard many people at the time lose their minds with 8. Because it looked like they took Final Fantasy VII FMVs and ran with it into realism, which was, and kind of still is to many today, an inherent virtue to a game. But it really was a weird first impression for me. As I eventually played the game, I had a lot of fun with it, but I was left disappointed by the overall experience coming off the heels from FF7. Yes, it still had a bunch of structural elements that defined Final Fantasy, from ATB gameplay to its approach to world traversal, but 8 didn't seem to have the same level of polish to storytelling and characterization, adopting a style that was the biggest departure from any approach taken by that point. The gameplay, while connected to the well-regarded approach of its predecessors, was less intuitive despite the loaded tutorials, far more grindy with its draw system, and unspeakably broken. Final Fantasy IX would be the title that would satisfy my hopes and expectations, as it returned to the series' roots and felt like the more natural next step from FF7. The return to stylized character designs, the mix of lightheartedness and extremely serious themes, the approach to balance between gameplay and narrative, and most importantly, the thematic background of FF9 was a direct continuation to 7 and 6's. It was a happy reunion with the direction of Final Fantasy I grew to love. But, unfortunately, I wasn't aware of how much of a swan song FF9 was going to end up being.
And I guess it's the sound that came after the swan song that's still up for debate. Some would say a brave new sonata rose up and evolved over the years, carrying us on a great wind of change. Whereas some fans since the early 2000s have endured a prolonged death rattle instead. Even though I loved Final Fantasy X, it was the game that sent shockwaves through not just gaming, but Final Fantasy as a property, uncoupling some of those key identifiers from the franchise. While for me the game retained wonderful storytelling, combat and music, the loss of some vital ingredients represented the beginning of a seismic shift. And of course, with Final Fantasy's very first sequel following shortly thereafter, its lukewarm reception and what it stood for as a departure from the inherent rules Sakaguchi had established for his franchise. Now, with the benefit of time, one could say that Final Fantasy was not just in the uncharted territory of uncertain futures, but bearing straight into a storm. The idea of a Final Fantasy VII Remake can be traced back to the turn of the millennium. If gaming journalists and fan forums were to be believed, Squaresoft were exploring PS2 remakes for 7, 8 and 9. 8 and 9 had moved the dial in terms of visual quality, and fans were spellbound further still as the Final Fantasy X demo shipped across the world. Against this backdrop, chatter of a 7 remake gained momentum. It was common to see message board posts exclaiming how dated 7's graphics were compared to 8 and 9. We were in a strange time where many Final Fantasy VII fans were deeply satisfied with the experience they had, but almost immediately looked to a remake to address what they perceived as a gulf in visual quality between the titles. A revelation laid bare by the significant advancements Squaresoft had made in its follow-up titles. Obviously those PS2 remakes never did come to fruition, but that didn't put an end to the speculation and anticipation. As fans, we always talk about that big red remake button Square Enix had to hand, but in those early years after 7's release, for Square, it was more of a miniature Switch hidden away in the corner of a dashboard somewhere, and for fans, probably a naive feeling that pressing it would be out of a desire to enhance 7's artistic value and preserve its appeal into the next console generation. It hadn't yet evolved into that big red break in case of emergency guaranteed cash injection type button. In 2003, Square Enix caught the fandom off guard, announcing the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. With the plans for a feature-length movie sequel to the 1997 classic, the real surprise came in the revelation that the characters were alive. Confirmation that they'd survived 7's famous ending. No more message board debates, no more daydreaming about what might have been. In the end, it wasn't Holy or the livestream that had sealed their fates. It was a truckload of Japanese yen reversing up the driveway of Square Enix headquarters, a new corporate philosophy steamrolling everything Squaresoft had stood for. Now Square Enix would have to somehow live up to the act of adding pages to a complete story. They would have to justify it in the public forum in the only way possible, win over the audience with an amazing story. I can't say I was exactly captured by the other compilation titles on offer, a prequel only available on PSP, a mobile game exclusive to Japan, a PS2 third-person shooter centered around Vincent Valentine. The truth was, all I cared about was the movie. In September 2005, I finally watched Advent Children. It was, at the time, just with Japanese voiceover and fan subtitles. As the opening section retold the events of Final Fantasy VII, goosebumps shot across my skin. To hear a voice recount the memories of a story I still held dear, to speak it into existence as if it was a historical event, now made all the more real just by reflecting upon it. Unfortunately, recounting the events of Final Fantasy VII would turn out to be the movie's strongest scene. For the rest of the near 1 hour 40 minutes, I sat confused and distant, save when epic sequences reeled younger eyes in with the vibrancy of spectacle. But watching the movie again with English voice acting only made my distaste all the clearer. Naturally, the internet was often rife with praise for a cinematic marvel. Advent Children's HD graphics seemed to drive the hype for a 7 remake all the more. And earlier in 2005, we'd seen the FF7 PS3 tech demo, which recreated the original game's introduction. There was the sense that Square Enix were toying with fans, and that a remake of one of the most beloved titles was just on the horizon. But while one hand teased a remake, the other hand, which had dealt a compilation, showed a willingness to not just obliterate the aesthetics and sensibility of Final Fantasy VII, but to also go to war against Final Fantasy's inherent value. Now more than ever, it was clear that there was a corporation behind my favourite gaming series. But would that affect any goodwill and fate fans might be reserving for a Final Fantasy VII Remake? Time would tell. Okay Hylian, I think this is a good spot to pass it back to you actually, because your channel has so far mainly focused on the original Final Fantasy VII, and across your videos you've barely talked about the compilation beyond a few passing comments, so let's hear it. What's your take on the continuation of 7 from isolated work to a full series? Did the compilation titles change your perception of 7? And finally, as a result of the compilation, did your excitement for a possible 7 remake change over time?
Man, where do I even begin? As soon as I heard the merger between Squaresoft and Enix would come with a push for sequels and prequels for Final Fantasy games in general, my skin already crawled in horror. The mainline games made up to that point were designed to be self-contained anthological works, and when it comes to Final Fantasy VII, the idea of any kind of sequel to it sounded preposterous, because it would essentially be committed to killing off the ambiguity of the ending, which was so crucial for its impact and philosophical tease it brings to the audience. But hey, if I were to at least give them a chance with FF7, it would be with prequels. Then came the barrage of compilation news, and I was hit with a second attempt at a movie by Square, which would serve as a direct sequel of FF7. I was already not a fan of the idea from the start, but then they started showing the visual direction, taking an overly dark, almost colorless look to a world that used to be quite colorful despite the threats it was facing. A world that, evidently from FF7's epilogue, won and recovered from Meteor Fall. A world where the lifestream won and nature would rebuild itself, where color would flourish more than ever. Not a great start, but hey, fingers crossed they had a good reason for that. The new designs did not land for me at all as well. I was repulsed by Cloud having this new hairstyle that abandoned its strong color and iconic spiky form that gave his silhouette its unique flair. His costume almost seemed like a weird attempt to capitalize on Bleach hype of the mid-2000s. Barrett was just... what? Seriously, why is he wearing an improvised fishing net? His overall look was barely recognizable. The facial design of the characters abandoning the heavily stylized approach from the original and adopting an almost uncanny version of the FF8 style in this overly gloomy setting was yet another major red flag. But even with all these grievances in mind, I wasn't ready for the actual story itself. Advent Children featured a completely backwards interpretation of key characters and their relationships, like Cloud's personality being warped into a self-defeating loser who struggles to move forward from what he had already proven to overcome in the original game. The film is riddled with turned pages being revisited because fans loved them too much. Remember Rufus being killed by Diamond Weapon after an attempt by the Shinra president to help save the world with the sister Ray? Aha! Gotcha! He's back, baby! He survived an explosion that annihilated entire floors of Shinra HQ all in one piece. And of course, the worst offender. This was the point where Square showed as well that they weren't just willing to bring back legacy titles back from their resting places, but also bringing actual main villains back from the dead. I couldn't believe my eyes, but they really retconned Sephiroth's annihilation in the livestream just so they could revive him for nostalgia bait. Sorry, Star Wars fans. The whole "somehow Palpatine returned" meme was already done by Final Fantasy over a decade earlier. The compilation of Final Fantasy VII, truly ahead of its time. In conclusion, Advent Children was an insult and a slap to the face for many Final Fantasy VII fans. People who, of course, weren't an edgy teenager who enjoyed FF7 on a superficial level. People who didn't think that just seeing these characters in pretty graphics and having Matrix-styled sword fights were enough to pass for a satisfying FF7 sequel. People who cared about the themes, character arcs, world building, and the overarching plot of the original. Beneath the impressive visuals, the film was guilty of compromising payoffs from the original game, portraying central characters in unrecognizable states with very poor explanations, and reviving characters and conflicts that were already resolved and done with. With this experienced frustration, I understood that things changed far too much at Square Enix and how they approached new and old Final Fantasy material. Many of the creative missteps seen in Advent Children would be further witnessed in later compilation titles to varying degrees. With each title released, there was always something from the original game being rewritten. There was always a payoff being weakened. And the general style of the compilation diverged so much from the original FF7 that it simply became something completely unrecognizable. My opinion on the original game didn't change because of these works, but they certainly made me appreciate the source material in a way I didn't before, and I understood why some things landed as well as it did. The compilation demonstrated a loss of touch with its roots and showed an increasing disparity between Final Fantasy VII and the philosophy driving the future of this IP. This general feeling fed an increasing loss of faith in the creative ability of key Square Enix artists heading important projects. Many of the issues I briefly touched upon would even bleed into other series and spin-offs as well. So it seemed like the approach taken with the compilation was going to be emblematic of Square Enix's future endeavors. Which brings me to the prospect of a Final Fantasy VII Remake. As you've said, as a result of Advent Children, many fans during the 2000s frequently talked about how cool it would be to get a remake of FF7 with HD visuals. I never saw FF7 as a game that needed a remake, but I also wasn't really opposed to the idea on paper. But even so, I felt conflicted at the time. On the one hand, the idea itself was interesting. Not because I wanted to see the characters I grew to love with the Advent Children style in FF7's story, of course, but because I thought the aesthetics of the original game deserved to be appreciated in a much higher resolution now that analog television gave way to digital television. Characters, locales depicted by the pre-rendered backgrounds, FMVs, they were all so beautiful in 1997, and the idea of seeing everything faithfully translated to modern graphical technology sounded very enticing. As a remake, it was also an opportunity to enhance and improve on the original game. Yes, with all my praise for FF7, I don't see it as a perfect work. But getting the game closer to that status is an attractive idea to see being materialized. In opposition to this set of advantages for an FF7 remake, the compilation of Final Fantasy VII proved that some of the artists managing the IP weren't willing to respect the original work in its entirety. The retcons that accumulated over the years not only made a revisit to the original game inconvenient due to how it would expose its dissonance with the newer titles, but also, in a number of ways, said retcons became the basis for how many of the newer fans of the franchise understood Final Fantasy VII's story and characters. This brought the danger of a remake of FF7 following the basic structure and themes of the original, but subject to a number of retcons that would make the game fit better in the compilation. Of course, there was a silver lining to this entire scenario. Given Square Enix's struggles in the late 2000s and the frequent fan criticism towards their works, which were eventually acknowledged by Square staff, if an FF7 remake was ever necessary, it was to be used as a way to show folks that they can still produce a fantastic work of art that is complete and normatively well constructed, while maintaining a strong footing in the source material that the franchise was built off from and felt missing for some time. It was an option that was, fundamentally, an easy path to profit, as they could exploit the legacy of what was the most popular work in their history in a time when remakes and adaptations in audiovisual media were starting to boom. In other words, like you said earlier, Orion, it was an emergency button to press if Square ever saw the need to recoup financial losses and consumer trust. And to fulfill that goal effectively, the remake would require a strong direction to push for a faithful approach to the story at the very least. This scenario made the prospect of a remake of FF7 sound promising for OG fans like me. But the days where Square Enix would find themselves in this situation seemed to be quite a distant future, even with the constant requests by fans to remake Final Fantasy VII, as Square was still pulling full steam ahead with their new projects, especially after getting the chance to open the doors for collaborations with Nintendo for spin-offs and ports of older titles. However, this distant future wasn't as distant as many were thinking. A lot of money invested in Final Fantasy XIII's engine, Crystal Tools, failed to give a strong return, as the FF13 trilogy failed to land a strong impact in sales and fan reception. Matters got worse with the release of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, which had severe problems tied to Crystal Tools as well as other factors. The MMO would be almost universally panned, causing even further losses to Square. The final nail would come in the form of Final Fantasy XV. The project was virtually a second attempt at a compilation of titles for a mainline Final Fantasy entry, spanning not just games, but also a film, an anime, and later on even a book. And the idea was to have that supporting work released close to the game rather than as a result of the game's success. FF15, a revived corpse of a passion project by Tetsuya Nomura, who was tragically removed from its direction early on, was the most expensive bet Square Enix has ever made by that point. They invested heavily on the new Luminous engine to develop the game, years of development and paying for an immense staff to make the game and its side content come to life. To make a good profit from the project, the game would need to match FF7's sales numbers. A failure here could cause the worst financial crisis Square Enix would face since Squaresoft's demise in the early 2000s. With that threat looming over their heads, and the development struggles that would only be publicly evidenced by the state of FF15 on release, Square Enix would see themselves at the perfect moment to press the big red button. Final Fantasy VII Remake would be finally unveiled at E3 2015 with a beautiful CG trailer showing a vast and realistic depiction of Midgar, with an increasing use of pivotal FF7 imagery and an incredibly meta-narration on top of it. The way they announced it and how it all came together was, quite honestly, fantastic. It was easily the most hype E3 moment in almost a decade. Everyone was beyond excited to see a game requested by fans for over a decade, spammed in comment sections and forums for every Sony and Square Enix conference, finally become materialized. The commentary surrounding the game was of sheer anticipation to experience key scenes and battles of the original game under a potentially jaw-dropping presentation, witness all the beloved characters going through the impactful arcs they know and love, and possibly see expansions that further enhance said story beats. People were hungry for a Final Fantasy experience returning to its roots in some form, for a Final Fantasy game to feel like it was as magical as it was back in the 80s and 90s. People missed Final Fantasy VII being Final Fantasy VII. And yes, despite Kitase being the producer this time, I, like many back then, was hopeful that a real remake of FF7 was coming to life. We didn't see how the characters and gameplay looked like yet, but maybe, just maybe, the game would look and play in a way that OG fans would be familiar with and happy with. The general context surrounding Square Enix and the industry allowed for expectations to orient towards FF7R being a faithful and tasteful revisit to Square's most legacy-rich title in its history. Hope was alive. I held out hope for Final Fantasy VII Remake for a while, even with the red flags we highlighted previously, but this hope would slowly start to die out as it did for many players. I remember that, for a lot of people, the announcement of Remake being structured as an episodic series of games was the first major point of concern. I guess you could say I was one of those people. At the time of this announcement, basically everyone initially understood the term episodic as referring to Remake being made in the modes of very short games like The Wolf Among Us by Telltale Games. That was a horrific payoff to what people were asking for, since people wanted a full-scale game to experience a complete adventure and the relevant story beats with updated presentation. Of course, Square Enix would later correct this interpretation by officially confirming each part would be full-length games in the style seen in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. This is why I don't personally consider this episode in history, as the moment I started to get suspect and feel scared for what Remake was becoming. Despite being in favor of FF7R being a single game, I was also on board for an ambitious expansion of Final Fantasy VII. The 1997 classic was structured as a 4-act story, so I could easily see a game being made for each act and expanding each act into a full-fledged plot. There was a path for greatness here.
And Hylian, I think as that path unfolded before us, we were getting a better sense of how Square Enix were looking to tackle this thing. For me, hearing that they'd be focusing on Midgar for the first game would mean either they bloat the city or they blitz through it. A Midgar-centric game seemed intriguing on paper but difficult to realise. With the revelation that the first part would be a 40-hour game, could the Metropolis offer enough material to stretch so far? Or was the beauty of the original's opening how it imparted tremendous scope and heart in only a few hours? I'm sure under the right hands, Midgar could have more stories to tell if the writers embraced the sensibilities and grittiness of the original, but my confidence in Square Enix was low. At the danger of repeating myself, although I can't help but stress it enough, the compilation had whittled away any anticipation I had in a 7 remake. My faith in creators revisiting their works was already eroding at the time based on my experience with media in general. So to see Cloud walk onto the screen at that E3 event back in 2015 didn't overly stir me. I would say I was cautious, because over time the daydream of a Final Fantasy VII Remake had been infected by the idea of an inevitable showcase for the careless storytelling we'd seen in the compilation titles. Although I felt there was a way to do a 7 remake justice, I didn't think it was within Square Enix's grasp. I felt certain they wouldn't be able to resist embracing the things that had given me pause. I knew that the expanding world of Final Fantasy VII was no longer speaking to me, and perhaps not even trying to speak to me. That would change over time as the marketing ramped up, and Square Enix leaned hard on the memories of the 1997 classic to try usher in fans who had stepped away a long time ago. But back around 2015, I had little real grasp of how far Square Enix would eventually run with a remake. My naive mind imagined a secret cave with a hidden Genesis boss battle, or perhaps side missions where you encounter random compilation characters. They'd be things out there affecting the ether, but by and large you could probably focus on the main of the story and grin and bear all the annoying static. An attempt to break the spine of Final Fantasy VII was not on my radar. That was inconceivable to me. In the years leading up to Remake, although there was a part of me that wanted to keep hope, I had a pessimistic outlook. I would say my anticipation levels were decreasing day by day.
Yeah, Orion, I completely understand what you mean. It wasn't easy to maintain the optimism all the way through up to release. Each review of new information unfortunately came with a drawback we had to accept, progressively declining the hype. I guess the moments that truly kickstarted a change in my anticipation for Remake were the game's first gameplay reveals before and after CyberConnect 2 was dropped as the game's main development studio. The PlayStation Experience 2015 trailer was the first time we ever got a look at FF7R outside of a CG trailer. While I was really euphoric for the game seemingly using the acclaimed orchestral arrangements by Shiro Hamaguchi, Cloud's design was really off-putting. Character design is very important to me, and it was a shame to see the character regress to Advent Children's sensibilities. His hair design, the overly dark colors to his soldier gear, his physique, his facial design, I wasn't really a fan of it. The gameplay also showed no sign of an appeal to the original ATB system, which was also a disappointment. But hey, if the rest of the game is still preserved, I can overlook these grievances just fine. I'd still be okay with a faithful world, the rest of the characters looking good under the new visual direction, and a combat system that at least appealed to some significant command-based mechanic.
I was aware some people were at odds with the character designs, some weary of the battle system design. I didn't think too deeply on it. Like you said, they were things I was willing to let go. It was as if all my energy was channeling towards the story, the one thing I felt had to be preserved in order to prop up a decent experience. Looking back now, I have a greater appreciation for preserving those other elements which I initially decided to let pass. I guess because in spite of losing the art style or the battle system, we should have been given something complete in return, but many of us are standing here with nothing in our hand to show for it. And maybe I feel a little foolish now for not feeling much of a feeling at all as I watched those artistic sensibilities slowly peel away, because I guess on some level I bought into the notion that everything was a progression and could lead to an advanced product in every way conceivable. I now know that to be a lie.
Indeed. Looking back at it all, I feel like I was far more forgiving of things I otherwise would have expressed great frustration with had it been your usual compilation title. I guess the notion of revisiting FF7 and having a blueprint already known to work made me think these misgivings were more easily tolerable because at least the story and characters, probably the things that suffered the most since the birth of Square Enix, would finally be in respectable condition. I mean, what could go wrong, right? The story was there. They knew it worked wonders. It's what got them to make this game in 2015. Maybe these changes could amount to something worthwhile, something interesting down the line that would justify it all. So while my anticipation started to decline with the 2015 PlayStation Experience review, my outlook on the game was still positive. The turning point for me, however, was the State of Play trailer from 2019. After being mesmerized by the visuals and the surprise of getting the first look of Aerith in Remake, I was floored by the ending of the trailer showing Sephiroth physically in front of Cloud taunting him. Was Sephiroth actually going to be shown on screen as early as Midgar? One of the most important aspects of building up Sephiroth as a villain was his absence from the game's first act entirely. His threat was powerful because his legend preceded him. For a good while, you didn't see him, only the destruction and death he caused, even if indirectly. Having Sephiroth appear in Remake before Midgar is done would have been a terrible choice, undermining this appeal, serving as an omen for even more changes in favor of fan service in the same vein as the compilation went for. But hey, that scene could have just been a vision, right? It's also just showing Sephiroth's back. It's not like they'd show him towering over Cloud from top to bottom, right? That's what people in the hype train told me, and I was willing to entertain their optimism for a while longer.
If I recall correctly, I also felt that Sephiroth's appearance was likely a vision, an unnecessary addition, but probably something small. Something interesting happened to me around that time. The more information that came through about Remake, the more footage I saw, the more I started to warm to the potential. Maybe the closer the game came to becoming a reality, and the closer I was pulled into its orbit, a primal desire to consume took over, to just enjoy. My radar was starting to malfunction. I was starting to get on board. I was actually, dare I say it, beginning to look forward to 2020. The Game Awards 2019 trailer was the one that really pulled me in at first, setting up the tale of a mercenary out for Gil, walking into an eco-terrorist group. It really focused on the beauty of 7's opening, gave me confidence that what Square Enix held true was the core sensibility of the original game. But I can still remember groaning when I saw dark shapes surround Aerith and Cloud. Of course, at the time, I didn't know what they were or the significance they'd end up having, but even then I was greatly disturbed at the sheer idea of riding a supernatural layer over the top of a classic scene, a deeply personal character introduction scene. The decision was simply mind-boggling to me. I think I secretly hoped, in a best-case scenario, that it was the beginning of a new battle sequence introduced at that moment with random monsters. But I was disturbed. I remember exclaiming aloud that they're messing things up already. As it turned out, that tease would encapsulate the approach Square Enix took, intruding and dare I say corrupting classic moments and themes for the thrill of something new. But again, I was a consumer out for a good time, and without the full information, I let these things go. I still had some optimism.
Man, I remember having a similar reaction to the whispers swirling around Cloud and Aerith. I remember thinking whether that was an alteration of the scene we knew and loved, or whether it was an addition to it where they're facing a new monster type stemmed from Sheeran's experiments. After the Sephiroth tease, I was genuinely worried about this scene when revisiting the trailer in anticipation of future updates. My optimism truly died when the Final Fantasy VII Remake demo was leaked on the PlayStation Store around late December 2019, an event which led to leaks featuring script, images, and other assets related to the final game story. The demo itself was already a significant point of frustration. I first played it at Gamescom on August 2019, so I got to experience early the shock of seeing the change where Shinra were now the ones responsible for the Reactor 1 bombing. I will explore the reasoning behind this being seen as a horrible change eventually, but I'm highlighting this experience now because I want to illustrate how, even before the leaks, I was still willing to give it a good shot, hoping that was the only grotesque change to take place in the game. Call it denial, copium, or anything in between, but I still saw a possibility that this was the only major story issue to be concerned about. In fact, my excitement and hopes for the game were still alive to the point that I already pre-ordered the game and was going to buy a PlayStation 4 with Final Fantasy VII Remake on release. To put this into perspective, I had zero plans to buy a PS4 by that point. PlayStation lost a lot of third-party exclusivity between the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 generations, as multi-platform games and the rise of PC gaming made the value of owning a PlayStation much harder to justify. Even first-party titles, to me, lost a lot of the appeal they used to have once we got to the PS3 generation. In short, I had lost interest in ever owning a PlayStation console again. FF7R was changing that, even if I held out hopes for unannounced ports in the future. Final Fantasy VII Remake was driving me to get a console I had little to no interest in. That was how much I was willing to give it a fair shot, how much I was still holding on to hope for something worthwhile to honor FF7's legacy. With this, the leaks came out and fully exposed the direction they were going for with Remake. It was a huge event. Even Kazushige Nojima, the scenario writer for the game, would take to Twitter to verbalize his frustration with the leaks, spoiling the surprise he had in store for us. Considering how much I was already willing to concede from what I wanted Remake to be by that point, and considering how rough the last 20 years have been for the franchise and the artists heading the project, I decided to look into the leaks myself. To be perfectly clear, I don't endorse leakers. I despise them and the whole culture surrounding these people. I was also quite aware of how often claims of leaks end up being red herrings. But the way the leaks broke out seemed like it really was the real thing, especially with official response to it coming not long after the event. Needless to say, the leaks ended up showing a lot of the changes being made to the original story, down to Sephiroth's constant presence in the game and him being the final boss in this interdimensional rift. We had Zack even appear in the story now. I couldn't even believe a lot of what I've read, as it was so blatantly not what FF7's story was. This wasn't a real remake of Final Fantasy VII at all, as was promised over years of discourse by Square. It was a what-if story, appealing to FF7 as a premise to the current plot. It was a stealth sequel. Remake here wasn't meant to be understood as a descriptor of the type of work it is, but rather a subtitle intrinsically related to the actual story. With this revelation, I decided to cancel my pre-order of the game immediately and try to see it for myself if it really is everything I read and if it was as bad as it looked. Thankfully, I was blessed to have a friend back then who knew how much FF7 meant to me, and he already had a PlayStation 4 ready to boot. As the game launched, he bought the game and I was able to play it for myself over the course of weeks. My full experience with the final game was quite the thrill ride, to say the least. I really have a ton to say about Remake, but I guess I should briefly summarize my take on the game here so I don't make this video as long as, well, what I usually do. In many ways, I consider Final Fantasy VII Remake to be a tragic work of art. I absolutely see the love and passion that went into the creation of this game in areas like environmental design and monster design. It has qualities like how the battle system is, to an extent, a smart way of bridging action with the command-centric focus of the source materials approach. The music, in its inconsistent delivery due to a decentralized direction in composition among the team of composers and arrangers, can definitely hit really strong in moments, especially with the pieces done by Masashi Hamauzu. The game has some good eye candy. It's a lot more colorful and vibrant than the entire compilation of Final Fantasy VII has been prior. There are some emotional payoffs to draw here, I'm sure to many, in varying degrees. But beneath the appeal to emotion, nostalgia, and shiny visuals, there is a twisted disregard for the source material's thematic approach, characterization, and plot structure. It may be the most polished entry in the compilation, but FF7 Remake is still riddled with moments of bloated material to justify the work's length, changes to the original story that fail to live up to the execution seen in the source material, additions written very clunkily into the plot, and even some lines that are as bad as dilly-dally shilly-shally.
You owe me a pizza.
I think the worst aspects to the game that cause Remake to be as terrible to swallow as Advent Children and Crisis Core are its handling of subversions and the setups for the future. Destroying a god of fate tied to the planet in a parallel universe, defeating Sephiroth at his strongest we've ever seen in the very first act, the nods by Aerith and Sephiroth to their knowledge of the future, and the survival of Zack are plot points that fundamentally rock Final Fantasy VII's story, its themes, and the way characters are supposed to relate with each other. To be clear, considering FF7R's writers aren't amateurs, we're now dealing with the setup for an interdimensional story where characters follow familiar plot beats but are obviously prone to radical changes later down the line, meeting characters along the way that are meant to be dead and serve as the perfect payoff to the thousands of fanfiction material written over the past 20 years. This story is far away from what FF7 was about. Ignoring the borderline false advertising with how misleading their rhetoric was with this game prior to release, FF7 Remake takes a path that even the compilation didn't dare to explore, being much more aligned with the kind of content seen in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, and for good reason. To some, the very novelty of this approach to FF7 is self-justified, regardless of its execution and how there was no setup for a requel to exist in the compilation. But I think it's important to highlight and recognize how out of place this approach was to this world and this project when it comes to attending a demand in existence for over a decade. In fact, it should have been done for something like a game that needed a remake. One with mechanics that allowed for a requel with dimensional travel within the realm of plausibility, Final Fantasy VIII. Much like what you said, Orion. To anyone who didn't watch his video on that topic, please check it out. In conclusion, Final Fantasy VII Remake is tragic, because it really disappointed on an unbelievable level when it clearly had the production value and the passion from some key people to materialize an artistic endeavor with potential for greatness that exceeds most of what Square was able to create since the merger. I went in with the best of intentions, accepting numerous losses and decisions that I didn't agree with, wanting it to at least still shine within its design choices. Unfortunately, the quality of execution and how Remake's changes are at odds with the original made the end result a disappointment and a significant source of frustration for me. With all of that said, I guess it's time to hear more about your own story, Orion. How was your first experience with the game? Did you also look into the leaks, or did you go into it blind?
I went in completely blind. I'm not sure how I missed the leaks, but I did. The demo had pleasantly surprised me. At least at first, it seemed like an attempt to stay true to the original by retaining the sense of weight and momentum of the classic opening. In my life, I had walked that path from station platform to the reactor so many times, and this time I was possibly more engaged than when I'd booted up the classic game for the first time all those years ago, because now I knew the story, I knew what was to come, I was returning to old friends, but at the same time it felt new. I was alert, very present, taking in everything. It was a trip to see Cloud and Barrett arguing on the elevator, to appreciate every movement, every look, every line spoken or left unspoken. The music sounded great, I was enjoying the combat. But like you, Hylian, my alarm bells sounded when I saw Shinra dial in the attack on the reactor, seemingly absolving the party of the guilt of bombing Midgar. The price of a grey decision suddenly evaporated, a price that I had initially fallen in love with the original game for, a decision rendered purely to paint the main characters in a more heroic light. That was my first experience with being gaslit on the topic of Remake. Even discussing that issue online was a point of contention for fans. I was immediately informed that nothing had changed, that this was the exact way it played out in the original game. They just never showed the scene with Shinra and Heidegger. It had happened in the background. Or I was instructed that throughout the original, Avalanche did zero damage. It was just Shinra making them think they had. A few days before the game launched, I published my very first video. There's a part near the end where I talk about what could go wrong with Remake. I mentioned that bombing scene, and I remember getting a couple of comments from people explaining how I was wrong. I wasn't really accustomed to sharing my thoughts with other fans in detail, so this was probably the first time I'd held a true mirror up and had to contrast my vision of Final Fantasy VII with what other fans had experienced. And it really did make me stop and think, did I get this wrong? I started looking back at the original, second guessing myself, but the truth was, some fans had either misinterpreted the original or were willfully moving the goalposts to give Square Enix a path to victory, whatever the cost. That was a sign of things to come. When I uploaded that video, I remember thinking my cautious comments on Remake could become laughable if the game absolutely knocks it out of the park. But funnily enough, that was a best case scenario for me, because if the game rocked, it rocked and Final Fantasy was back. But as I pretty much said in that video, the bombing scene was a clear message that Square Enix were willing to break apart building blocks from the original game, sending cracks through keystones that helped make Final Fantasy VII what it was, that helped make it as popular as it was. The reason Square Enix were even in the position to do a remake and capitalise on the goodwill towards the original game was because of moments like that, moments that had drawn people into the original. But those moments were now fair game. And for what? To ensure that not a soul playing had a shred of doubt towards the integrity of these characters? But in spite of what I felt was a huge misstep, I bought the game. I was excited to play it. I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. The pandemic was sinking its claws in, people were starting to work from home, and a Final Fantasy VII Remake was a convenient escape. Remake fans probably imagine I played a game with a pen and notebook by my side, listing every sin I could find. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Whatever doubts I had felt, I put them aside, and I gave the game a fair shake. I made a vow to enjoy the experience, and to entertain the fact that new decisions could have new value. As the game progressed, my strategy was often challenged. The game presented moments that made it difficult to reconcile as an FF7 fan. For example, Sephiroth appearing too early. I felt it was a mistake, but I did set it aside. I'd planned to come back and analyse it later and say, well, why did they do it like this? And after completing the game, maybe there'd be a good reason. As that scene came to a close, I remember Cloud said,
"I'm seeing things. Fumes from all the Mako, maybe."
An attempt to misdirect the audience, but at the same time, a line written with the knowledge that it lies exposed for scrutiny. A line that allows the possibility that Cloud may be wrong. When the Promised Land theme from Advent Children played, I understood something was different. Nothing is by mistake. That wasn't just there because it was a cool track. It wasn't just a nod to Advent Children. It was a nod to the events of that movie. But I didn't fully grasp or accept what was going on until Cloud experienced the flash forward to Aerith's death. It was then I realised this was a time travel story, a sequel. Still, I refused to follow that through. I hoped I was wrong. And even though I found Roach tedious, I motored past and looked forward to the next scene, but the issues kept accumulating, the whispers interrupting the pacing, the padded out new sequences, the forgettable new characters, the limp honeybee inn. But for every issue I'd find, there would be something that would pull me back in. And it didn't have to be a nod to the old either. Before starting Remake, I remember hearing Hollow on the advert for the game, and thinking what a bad idea it was to add this song. it didn't feel like Final Fantasy VII to me. It was only when I arrived in Sector 5 and heard the instrumental version that I realised how beautiful it was, and I accepted its place in this remake. Because the truth is, I didn't have an agenda, and if something was new, all it needed was to be good. In spite of the issues I'd had, I was still enjoying the experience overall. I kept forgiving things. It wasn't until Wedge survived a plate collapse that I felt the dream was over. The developers were butting heads with the themes of the original game. Now this was a world of clean-cut heroes and very much alive heroes, living in a diet version of Midgar, a watered-down soda, missing the full fat that made the original nighttime metropolis so special. My memories on the chopping block. Remake was some other kid's bus ride home. Yet the game rallied late as I entered the Shinra building and delivered some standout moments, and I thought maybe they can pull this together for a decent finale. Then my only points of contention will be Wedge's Alive, the strange whispers, the overuse of Sephiroth. Perhaps I was living in total denial, but I think what had happened was, as an FF7 fan, I had accepted the truth that this remake had fallen far short of my hopes and dreams. But as a fan of storytelling, I would continue to search for the value within this experience, appraising it on its structural strengths and weaknesses, on its own storytelling ability. In other words, there were two critics at work. When Sephiroth drove his sword through Barret, I guess I was supposed to be surprised, but my shock was reserved for the developers, who somehow had put subversion as their #1 goal. A frustrating decision when throughout the game they had pretty much displayed an aptitude to create a faithful remake, but had cast it aside for shock value. The story gave me one last kick, delivering a perplexing, poorly written finale, which sent Remake straight off the deep end, and, in the eyes of some fans, perhaps threatened to drag the classic game with it through guilt by association. I didn't want that. I knew I'd always have the original, but I didn't want Remake to affect the way I thought about the original. So to keep me sane, to help me compartmentalise it, I had resolved to viewing it all as a kind of fan fiction. But I don't think I or the developers fully understood that even though the classic game was there forever, that the way people interpret it could change. For some, it wouldn't just be Final Fantasy VII, the groundbreaking 1997 game, it would be FF7 the springboard for the split timeline shenanigans of its sequel. Just as it's harder to separate The Matrix from its sequels, even though one could choose to watch no further than the end credits of the first movie, perhaps it would be hard for some fans to draw a line under the ending of FF7, knowing the colossal trilogy that lurked beyond it. Going online after finishing Remake, I was not surprised to find huge praise for the game. After all, it seemed to be catering to fanfiction desires, forging a path to a happy ever after. And I knew for many fans, just following their favourite characters would be enough, down whatever wormhole or across whatever broken landscape. But I guess what did surprise me about the online Discord was how quickly Remake fans were shouting down people who were critical of the game. They were even chasing off tame comments, such as people vocalising their confusion at the ending, or people feeling conflicted and trying to make sense of their thoughts in real time. There were people out there looking for someone to convince them how great Remake was, so they could embrace it and enjoy it. All they wanted was some rationalisation to help tip them over the edge. Even those people were rounded on. Play the original, touch grass, you're not a Final Fantasy fan. My disappointment in Remake, coupled with the ugliness displayed by some fans, was my motivation for speaking out. I started writing a little rant video straight away, and later followed it up with a tongue-in-cheek critique of some of the more rabid Remake fans I had encountered. I had not anticipated being completely at odds with Remake's decisions, so it's as surprising to me how the topic of Remake has since dominated my channel. Around about that time there were some YouTube critique videos up, but they were nowhere near as plentiful as the videos praising and reinforcing the wonders of Remake. How about you, Hylian? Was it hard to find critiques on Remake?
Well, my best hope of finding a reasonable critique on the game was definitely YouTube, given how the approach the journalistic establishment had with the game's release demonstrated fundamentally different values and standards from the kind of criticism I think should be valued. With that said, I distinctly remember this 1-hour critique by Never Knows Best and a 2-hour video by Nam's Compendium that caught my eye back then. A number of videos started popping up within a month after the game's release, a lot of them coming in with very different approaches and tones. Positive critiques, like the ones from Action Button and Angry Joe, got more traction in the beginning, not only because of their established audiences, but also because the fandom's mobilization towards that kind of response favored a lot of the upwards trend that those videos got. With that said, in the long run, I think that critiques embracing the game in more complete manner and not afraid of being negative towards the game definitely garnered more appreciation with people. Your channel, Orion, ended up appearing in my suggested feed only a year after your first critique released. Even a friend of ours, Hylian, ended up strongly suggesting your work to me in late 2021. And in the end, I see channels like yours only growing with time. Once Rebirth commits to the crazy changes Remake set up for, I can see a bright future ahead. Speaking of which, I might as well ask you, with how, passionate the modern Final Fantasy fandom is, and considering the dedicated following for Remake enthusiasts like Maximilian Dude and Tim Rogers, did you ever experience any form of gaslighting with the game? Did you ever consider whether your position was misplaced and maybe the game was as good as the fans were saying? And were you intimidated from speaking up and expressing your views on FF7R back then?
My feelings were so strong that I knew right away what my position was. That said, I watched and read a lot of Remake fan reaction. I tried to understand the perspective of appreciation. I asked questions about myself, and I think it's healthy to. Naturally, when so many people are saying something different, I think you should investigate. And of course, as a fan of FF7 and those characters, there must have been a part of me that wanted to find a way into this pro-Remake frenzy and to just enjoy it. But no matter what way I rationalised the changes Square Enix had made, I couldn't get on board with them. I played Remake twice before speaking out, Japanese voices, hard mode, just to switch things up. The structural issues were undeniable, there were some serious storytelling breaches. Sure, I was disappointed as an FF7 fan, but even as a fan of storytelling, I found it near impossible to reconcile the decisions Square Enix had made. All roads seemed to lead back to subversion for the sake of subversion. In that, the writers had been successful because it had surprised and it had ignited discussion, but that was never a measure of quality, so I had no doubt in my thoughts. Sure, it's a little intimidating to speak up when you know the backlash you could get for it, and naturally I've had videos where some of the comments have been unpleasant, but I've never regretted what I've said. I suppose if there was any hesitation in speaking up, it was knowing that as soon as I did, I would become that guy who moans about modern Final Fantasy. But pretending to like Remake just to ride an algorithmic wave was out of the question. So in speaking honestly about my feelings, I would have to become a hate channel. People label you such, and I think they do that because it makes them feel better. It's inconceivable to them that an FF7 fan or even a Final Fantasy fan could dislike Remake and not have some disingenuous angle. As if we didn't want another game, another experience to love and enjoy. And if I was in this simply for the business of hate farming, I'd have grown tired of that long ago, especially after tasting the venom from radical Remake fans. But I'm still here because I love Final Fantasy VII and I want to keep talking about it because it continues to motivate and inspire me. So I guess I should throw back those questions to you, Hylian. How did you feel about your take on Final Fantasy VII Remake being opposite to the hype culture prevailing at the time? And did you ever consider staying quiet about your feelings and just moving on?
Of course, I would be lying if I said it wasn't intimidating to see myself at odds with a good portion of the fanbase and general reception by media outlets and mainstream YouTube channels. But I was no stranger to this situation, as I already experienced it with Star Wars The Force Awakens, a film that was received very positively for some time before The Last Jedi made people reconsider the trilogy as a whole. I can't say whether FF7's own sequel trilogy will face a similar change in level of scrutiny or not, but I can say that my opinion didn't change because of the hype culture, and likely won't change with future installments given most of the game's issues begin and end in Remake, and the ones that don't end in Remake set up for story directions that need to be paid off in ways that need to commit to the radical shift from the source material for the writing to be coherent on a basic level. I'm someone who tends to build my own opinion without needing to tie my judgment to the social experience of appreciation for a work, and I strongly believe in the normative aspects of art. Majority opinion isn't necessarily concerned with these things, and that's considering that the vocal and mainstream figures are also not necessarily representing a majority to begin with. I think we should be mainly concerned about whether a view is well reasoned and argued considering the normative standards we use for communication, artistic production, etc. So, with all this in mind, I can say I was relatively unfazed with the reception disparity between me and a bunch of mainstream folks. The positive reception from some people was to be expected as well, given the core fandom that still stuck around to Final Fantasy discourse faithfully are the ones who sung praises for Square's more recent outings, including compilation material like Crisis Core. Remake is a more polished continuation of this modern philosophy of Final Fantasy, so it was only natural that the game would garner a rabidly positive response from these content creators and outlets. Other relevant figures who gave their takes in the mainstream, like Angry Joe and Critical Drinker, regardless if you, dear viewer, like them or not, were often YouTube personalities which openly expressed either a limited experience with the source material or were completely new to Final Fantasy VII, which makes their analysis unlikely to be a critique deeply rooted in the source materials tied to Remake, which is what FF7R deserves to be evaluated with. I can definitely see the appeal the game would have for a newcomer though. I'm just not part of that group of people. Which leads me to my next point. Whether I thought I should stay silent about it. I tend to be an outspoken person, especially when I see a work of art achieving something great or failing to live up to its legacy. So, by premise, I wasn't intimidated into being silent. Yes, even with the rather cult-like behavior a vocal part of the fandom has, I was still bent on making my voice heard. And that's not just a result of an impulse of mine, but also of me strongly believing in the importance of different opinions and how freedom of expression and thought is vital for art analysis and discussion. The better constructed arguments should be allowed to prevail regardless of whether it's the popular opinion or not. To conclude, and to give an idea of how much I was not intent on staying silent, FF7 Remake was the very spark to light my fuse of getting my opinion out of message boards and vocalize it onto YouTube. I was already deeply inspired at the time by the work of Mahler, a media critic on YouTube famous for his long-form chronological critique content. As FF7R released, I realized how much this approach was missing in game criticism and how important it was for someone to go in excruciating detail on why the original FF7 was so successful and why Remake didn't live up to the source material. I also thought it was vital for someone to really compile all the context surrounding the games, to end so much of the misinformation that still runs rampant in Final Fantasy discourse in general. This is what drove me to create my channel and start working on A Living Legacy, A Journey Through Final Fantasy VII, a chronological, in-depth analysis of the original game. And I think the best part of it is that works like yours and mine, Orion, are opportunities for disenfranchised fans of FF7 to have a voice in the mainstream, to gain traction, and express the much-needed criticism for Square and their artists to witness and consider for the future. I know that there are a lot of people like us out there who could be united under endeavors like ours, waiting for our voices to reach them. Would you agree, Orion?
Absolutely, and that's been my biggest joy in making my videos, creating a space where people can voice their opinions. I knew others felt the same as me, I could see it in socials, and not to make it sound too dramatic, but I could see those people getting cut down or exiled from their communities. I felt it was important that people were voicing their take, and not just letting the master narrative take hold. I'm very happy over here in this little community. There are intelligent, funny, friendly people in the comments, and I always appreciate their encouragement and support in allowing me to just have an opinion about a video game. And I'm happy that the people who watch my channel tend to be of the opinion that Remake fans should be allowed to fully enjoy their experience. We don't wish to take anything away from them. And I'm also happy that there are some Remake fans who seem to watch my channel just to hear this side, just as I listen to theirs. Because there needs to be space so that we can talk through our disappointment after so many years of longing, and also to critique these products in an honest and fair way. And each comment or critique of Remake should not be seen by fans as a call to arms or declaration of war upon their existence. That's why I'm going to continue speaking honestly, for as long as I'm able.
It really is great to see how much we align there as well, Orion. Given how much it's important to get our vision out there, I might as well bring to the table the topic of what would have made Remake work for us, be it the requel approach to a Final Fantasy title, be it an actual remake of FF7. I should start by addressing a really common talking point by Remake fans about proponents of FF7R criticism, that critics of the game would only accept a one-to-one remake of the original Final Fantasy VII. How true do you think that statement is, Orion? And if you don't think it's true, what kind of changes were you open to?
There were obvious issues with the original FF7. If there was ever an opportunity to add to its majesty, then it would be welcomed with open arms. But if you tried to strip away the things that fans loved, of course there would be resentment. I was always open to changes as long as they offered quality. If I wanted a one-to-one remake, I would not have appreciated Hollow and the overall new soundtrack, the Shinra building VR tour, or the moonlit walk between Aerith and Cloud. I wouldn't have enjoyed the battle system. And there were more things I entertained in Remake while playing it, things that turned out to be a dead end. For example, I was intrigued by expanded moments with Jesse, Wedge and Biggs, into thinking that all of it was an even bigger setup for a more dramatic death scene. By the game's end, we discover that perhaps no one stays dead. So now, with a new lens, I see little value in what Square Enix tried to do with their characters, and feel a little foolish for having been suckered in by more exposure to these characters somehow meaning more value. But playing the game in the moment, thinking the expanded scenes would lead to the same devastating conclusion I knew, I was finding value. If I was such a die-hard enthusiast for exact replication of material, then I would have been furious at every inch of expanded material. But that's not how it happened. The remaster versus remake argument, the retroactive definition of what those terms should mean to suit what Square Enix gave us, and the guilting of fans has been spectacular to witness. Now it seems if you wanted anything close to a faithful remake, you are the minority. Even though the fandom cheered for a remake, it turns out they secretly wanted to break away from the original story, and anyone who wanted a faithful remake should have known better. This was never about you, because the end goal was never a faithful remake, they'll have you believe. That's so disingenuous because their hype for a near faithful remake was off the scale. Do people think Max Dude only started hyping Remake once he realised it was a sequel? Don't they remember his infamous reaction to the Remake trailer? His hype, which took on a sort of legendary status in the community, was based purely on getting to relive Final Fantasy VII again, not a timeline-bending sequel. It's amazing how quickly some Remake fans then turned and pretended they didn't want a faithful remake. How did they reconcile their own hype and their favourite YouTubers' hype leading into Remake? It's fine to say, well, the direction Square Enix took Remake was so good that I now prefer what they did compared to a more faithful remake. That's fine by me, but to lie and say you never wanted a faithful remake is absurd. But the remaster versus remake argument, one-to-ones and all that noise, to me it's all just a distraction. The difference in agreement between fans is quite simple really. Some thought the changes were good, some thought they were bad. This side of the argument is largely driven by the fact that we have seen enough within Remake to determine how we feel, and we can point to the specific problems. We can hold those things up and say quite clearly why those things fail for us. And I don't need to see the future trajectory of sequels to make a determination on Remake's quality. It's in the books, it's history, it's there to be judged. To sum it all up, I'm not afraid of change. As I've always said, change is good if it's good. How about you, Hylian? What do you make of that claim about a one-to-one remake being the only acceptable outcome for fans like us?
To put it really lightly, I'd say it is a grotesque mischaracterization of the position most of us take when criticizing Remake while completely missing the point of the conversation. And deep down, it serves as an emblematic display of hypocrisy by a number of people who repeat this nonsensical argument, something you just described. And I say it's a display of hypocrisy for a very simple reason. Almost every veteran fan of FF7 and the compilation, both critics and enthusiasts of Remake, looked forward to the project by highlighting how much anticipation lied in the faithful recreation of classic scenes. Yes, even with the fundamental changes to the core plot being imminent in future parts, you can still see even now how many Remake fans express their hype to witness moments like the Gold Saucer date, Palmer being run over by a truck, the Nibelheim incident, and Aerith's death, all being recreated in detail. In summary, their excitement has been rooted since the beginning in wanting certain things to be like in the original, even if their reaction to any kind of change to said things is discarding their initial wishes immediately, because this project just has to be good. And this is precisely what makes them shaming OG Final Fantasy VII fans for wanting faithfulness in a remake so ironic. Now, to address why the claim that, quote, remake critics would only be satisfied with a one-to-one remake is a grotesque mischaracterization of our position, I think it's important to set in stone the very heart of the discussion at hand. Differently from how many remake fans might try to frame the conversation as, the debate is not about whether changes of any nature should exist or not. It's about what kind of changes should be made, where to apply them, and how to execute them. The core of FF7R criticism comes from a fundamental disagreement in how the changes were made as a remake, how it affects its own story, and how the requel approach doesn't fit the material it's building off from, unlike the project's source of inspiration. We briefly touched on this earlier, but it's pretty much unanimous how, despite the near-universal praise Final Fantasy VII got, the original game had flaws and some good space to grow. The remake that fans like us wanted wasn't a one-to-one take on the source material, but rather a version of Final Fantasy VII that expands responsibly and coherently its story and universe as a means to strengthen the already existing plot, world building, and characters. A remake that could give FF7 a chance to be even better by addressing its flaws and limitations. So yes, we actually wanted changes too. We just wanted ones that don't radically diverge from the core themes, backstories, important plot points, and presentation style, things FF7R was guilty of. Because we still want Final Fantasy VII to be Final Fantasy VII. We want things like a better integration of materia into people's everyday lives, expanding the explorable areas of Midgar to all sectors before the Don Corneo sequence, fix plot holes and polish the story's continuity, like reconsidering Zack's journey from Nibelheim to Midgar, introduce new characters as relevant to their own quest lines that complement the existing plot points. There is so much I could list here. Yes, there really is such a thing as changing something by adding and enhancing the existing material, instead of mainly relying on content revisionism. Crazy concept, I know. In conclusion, the claim that we would only accept a one-to-one remake is far from the truth, and shows the severe lack of engagement by a good portion of the fandom in addressing criticism towards the game honestly and directly. Remake could have really been satisfying if the changes it brought were net positives when looking at the original game, and the debate should be on whether each change is a net positive or not, and why. With that said, I should ask you, Orion, since I touched on it briefly here, do you think the requel approach that defines FF7 Remake could have ever worked for FF7's continuity? What do you think would have been necessary to make it work if you think its design wasn't possible to fit?
It's a good question, and I think I'd have to return to the two critics again. As an FF7 fan, I would say no. The original game expressed life and death as its theme, and that thematic pillar held strong, even right down to the ending. The ability to remake a timeline goes entirely against the message of the original game. Fans like to say remake is titled as such because it's about Sephiroth remaking the timeline, and of course, remake means to do again. Doing it again, getting a second chance, those things feel fundamentally against the original game's theme. The things we lost were lost. Only the things we had here in the moment, within our grasp, were the things we had a chance of saving. Of course, by breathing life into the original FF7, Square Enix were doing it again, but rather than the term remake perhaps being a clever nod to the story's meta nature, the expression should have stayed true to that which was proposed by the famous E3 presentation. A remake, exactly what we all knew the word meant. That's as far as the remake sentiment should have extended. It should never have bled into the diegetic content of the game, not leading to a brand new timeline, allowing new possibilities, characters to cheat death, and, through a multiverse, dilute death so as to make it near meaningless. Now, as a storytelling fan, I look at Remake and see its structural issues, of course, but beyond that, I see a story that wants to be new and do surprising things, but it's trapped within the body of the original game. And as the plot progresses, this new life form begins to tear free, each subtle movement at first alerting senses or sometimes even going unnoticed until it tears through the body's connected tissues and fibres, and as it struggles to freedom, it damages internal organs in the process, and it clambers out, totally unrepentant, seemingly unburdened by the desecrated shell it once haunted, and it stands as this alien thing with an alien goal. That newborn thing, exposed, must find its own way in this world, because its host can no longer help it. The new thing can continue to point to the old thing's memory, yet it must find its own way to survive. But it will be so hard, because just the sheer exercise to break free from its host has taken something from it too, held it back in unimaginable ways. A sentiment the developers seemed to express. They wanted to reach for the new, but felt a responsibility to the old, torn between and lost in some confusing middle. There's the issue with transparency too. If Square Enix had told you up front that they were creating a sequel series to FF7 and that it would span multiple games, how would you have felt? I'd have felt much better about the whole situation. My expectations would have been nullified. But they didn't do that because 1, they wanted to make you think they were remaking the original game, and 2, they believed the surprise would be groundbreaking. And sure enough, the shocking part of Remake is the surprise of finding out it's a sequel. However you process that revelation, that's the moment Square Enix dreamed about for you. At some point in the development, they decided this wasn't a faithful remake anymore, and at some point in the development, they decided they wanted to stun you. But once the shock was done with, the story still had to stand on its own feet. Could a requel approach ever have worked? I could say it may have worked better if Square Enix had been upfront with fans from the start about what they were doing, allowing the developers true creative freedom so they weren't towing a line between the original story and a sequel. But you may be sitting there thinking that would never have worked because the hype was generated by the subversion. In that case, consider what that alone would tell you. I could say something crazy like a requel could have worked better if it opened with the original game's ending and showed Sephiroth returning to the start of the original game and from within 10 minutes blowing the trajectory of the original game completely off course so that the bombing mission doesn't even take place and leaning immediately into a true what-if style story. Or I could say, as I've always maintained, that when facing Destiny on the expressway, the developers should have put themselves in the shoes of the characters just once, rather than choosing an outcome for them that they have little reason for pursuing. That giving the characters clear and precise reasons for making the decision they made would have helped elevate the material. I could say anything like that Square Enix could have handled it so much better, and while I believe it, the truth is, I'm too much of a fan of the original game to appreciate any attempt to subvert it.
Really nice to hear your thoughts on the matter. I think the topic doesn't come up in FF7R discourse as much as it should. With this, I'd like to ask you, despite the disappointment Remake has brought, do you have any plans to play FF7 Rebirth? How do you plan to engage with the game and content on it in the future?
I'm feeling conflicted actually because I want to be able to review and talk about Rebirth in detail, and I don't feel like I can do that fairly and accurately without getting especially close to it. Sure, I could watch a Let's Play walkthrough, but then there's the question of where do I get footage for my own channel? What if I'm just covering cutscenes and story elements but missed things I would have talked about by experiencing the game with me controlling where I visit or revisit, or who I choose to talk to, or what I see and miss, and so on? But at the same time, I feel like the only clear way to express my disappointment with Remake would be to not buy Rebirth. With Intermission, I waited until it appeared on PS Plus, which I already had a subscription for. With Rebirth, perhaps I have the option of renting a physical copy through many of the rental services that operate over here, but I suppose both of those options are probably contributing to some overall metrics, which Square Enix can infer as a measurement of quality. To some, this conversation may sound incredibly petty, but at the same time, would it not be hypocritical of me if I continue to pay Square Enix for the things I say I don't want? I think as a content creator, and someone with a desire to analyse how Square Enix handles the sequel, I do plan on playing it, and the way I do that is still kind of up in the air. As far as Remake and the trilogy as a whole, I plan to keep discussing it for as long as I have the will and the motivation to keep going. How about you, Hylian? Have you given up on the Remake trilogy, or will you still try to experience its future parts? And finally, how are you going to engage with Remake moving forward as a content creator?
First off, I just want to express that I'm really looking forward to your content on Rebirth for sure. Great to hear about your future endeavors, and I hope your motivation is a fire that never dies out. Now, with regards to my own experience with this FF7 trilogy moving forward. In terms of investment on deriving satisfaction from the project's quality in storytelling and honoring the original game's legacy, I'd say that ship has sailed. Unfortunately, I know that the trilogy is not for fans like us, and Square has decided to take FF7 even further into the direction of the compilation's appeal. Their promises to fans like us were not fulfilled. With that said, I don't see myself staying quiet about it, and, despite my frustrations, I'm still really interested in seeing how the story and characters unfold. Yoshinori Kitase, the man responsible for handling the franchise today and the strongest voice in shaping FF7's sequel trilogy, once said in an interview that the reasoning behind fundamental changes being brought to FF7's storyline and remake stemmed from his impression that people would only be hooked by the project if it changed things significantly because of the unpredictability of how the story would progress. I could highlight how his theory is flat out wrong on a general sense, and how much it ignores execution as a means of driving audience engagement. But I can at least say he was right on how Remake would generate interest and curiosity from fans like me. I don't think, however, that the type of interest it spawned for some of us was the intended result Kitase envisioned. To put it bluntly, I will absolutely follow future FF7R games closely, from their gameplay to how the story progresses, and I'll do so with the same kind of fascination I had when witnessing the Star Wars sequels. In other words, morbidly curious to see how far they deconstruct FF7 to turn it into something unrecognizable and irredeemable. I want to see how much they appeal to compilation era fanfiction and how much the changes they bring will continue to break its internal structure like Remake did with its own changes to things like Wutai and the Whispers. This type of work tends to be a phenomenal source of interesting case studies for understanding storytelling and the development of artistic endeavors in our modern age. This is why I'm determined to cover Remake, Rebirth, and the final part of this trilogy on my channel in the future, and I'll do so with the same chronological analysis approach as I am currently doing with the original Final Fantasy VII. I hope you look forward to it.
Well, I'm sure I speak for many when I say I'm eagerly looking forward to your critique of the Remake trilogy, Hylian. To close out our conversation, I think it would be interesting for both of us to share our predictions and hopes for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and its sequel. I should start by saying I have been a little cautious of trying to predict where this thing goes. Remake brought startling and unexpected changes that dramatically changed the way many people look at Final Fantasy VII. It's not out of the realm of possibilities to expect more jarring curveballs that take the story in directions even the most formidable theory crafters would fail to comprehend right now. For that reason, predicting Rebirth may seem like an exercise in futility, but I'm willing to say this much at least. I'm expecting bloat and a whole host of dull supporting characters to serve it to us. As we've glimpsed from the latest footage, iconic locations like Junan's Town in the Darkness and Calm's quaint, quiet vibe will be packaged as hopeful, cheery environments, filled with the bland, uniform, middle and upper class NPCs. I expect that right across the board, from Calm to Coral, as based on Remake's Midgar, Square Enix seem to have dispelled the sense of grime and the sense of danger the original game brought, leaving us with the approach of a sort of Unreal Engine 4 fan project, with NPCs batch imported in from a hipster database. Just as Midgar suffered in Remake, I'd be surprised if the world is half as engaging as the original games was. In terms of the story, regardless of how many timelines we're in, everything will converge at the Forgotten City. Zack's storyline will firmly cross with our heroes here, whether that's Zack physically being there or instead having a crucial role to play from a distance. After Remake, my sense was that there were two timelines at work here, and that we jump between the two, moving from Cloud to Zack, until their worlds ultimately combined. But if there were two timelines, there would be the dilemma of how to get Zack to the Forgotten City in time to save the Aerith we know, or even how to allow him to have an effect on our party's world. And mechanically, it's far cleaner for the writers if Zack is already in our hero's timeline when Rebirth begins. If it has already happened in Remake, then all the writers have to do is explain that to us early doors. I think it's possible Aerith may still die, purely for the fact that if Square Enix take that scene out, they'll feel like they need to top it in some way. And I don't think killing Tifa instead would have that same effect, as she already seems to be the logical next choice in the eyes of many fans, and Remake has already strongly hinted at playing that card. I guess the only way Square Enix might think they could top it and subvert your expectations would be to kill Cloud instead. I can see a scenario where Aerith dies, but the crux of the third part in the trilogy is finding a way to bring her back. I could also see that play out where Cloud is the character the party are trying to revive. And unlike the internet legends that led to nowhere, and the Game Shark codes that couldn't truly bring back what we'd lost, this time fans will get to bring someone back. So I think for Square Enix to give that to the fans, there will be a heavy loss at the end of this second part in the trilogy, as is only natural. A great low before a great high. I'd be surprised if Sephiroth is the main villain. After playing Remake, I didn't see how he could remain formidable throughout the story that was still to come. I can either see a new villain character that all the heroes must unite against, a stronger version of Jenova than we've yet seen, or perhaps a second version of Sephiroth that somehow retains that formidable edge that now seems to have been blown away at the end of Remake. As far as my hopes for Rebirth and beyond, I just hope the fallout is nowhere near as toxic as it was when Remake launched, because whatever Square Enix have chosen to unfold in the Forgotten City, whatever that thing is, we will have a landmark event at the end of Rebirth, and there's the potential that the debate may get wilder than what we experienced back with Remake. For many who are on the fence about Remake, this may be the moment they firmly choose to leap in a direction. How about you, Hylian? What do you see happening in future installments, and what are your hopes for the future of this project?
Considering the entire catalog of works that the artists heading this project are responsible for, and the current state of Square Enix, I guess you can say some things are very easy to make bets on. I expect the next installment to be as heavy on fan service as possible, at the expense of storytelling consistency and presentation, banking heavily on emotional payoffs from the compilation and the material created for Remake. These should range from the party meeting and interacting with Zack to Cloud meeting Jessie at the Gold Saucer as an actress. The Gold Saucer dates will be less about illustrating relationships with characters individually and more about delivering on as much shipping fantasies from the fandom as they can. Yuffie's revenge story will conclude in Rebirth and won't be as meaningful to her identity arc as her original one was. I fully expect the Deep Ground Stooges to become more relevant to the main conflict, and I'm willing to bet Sephiroth might not even be the main culprit by the end of the trilogy. I think Genesis will make a triumphant return and will likely be the key connecting the compilation's previous entries to the Remake trilogy in terms of continuity. After all, they wouldn't leave that cliffhanger without a payoff, right? Finally, as if it wasn't obvious enough, I think Rebirth will be the title that will commit to the story driving entirely off the rails from the original storyline, down to how the conflict will be contextualized and how characters will deal with it in life and death. The interdimensional travel shown in Remake will have obvious consequences, and considering we don't see the party return from the portal opened by Sephiroth, it wouldn't be shocking to see the party in Rebirth be met with an alternate universe of Gaia, likely the very same universe Zack is alive in. And yes, I don't think Aerith's death, as known by the original FF7, will play out anything remotely like the 1997 classic. I would not be surprised if, say, Cloud ends up actually killing her, or Tifa being the one getting killed off, or maybe Zack himself comes in and saves Aerith instead. As a result of the wild commitment Rebirth must take by virtue of Remake setups, I think the game will be the eye-opener for a lot of people who were fooled by the first entry in the trilogy. And like another famous sequel trilogy, Rebirth will get the combined weight of criticism deserved for both Remake and Rebirth. With regards to my hopes, I can only say that, knowing that this game isn't for me at all and is too far gone into material that is dissonant from FF7, I want this trilogy to be as comically wild with its story as it can, and appeal as hard to the fans supporting it as possible. Who knows, maybe this all leads into Advent Children and the compilation ends up being completely separate from the original game's canon. Everyone wins in the end, right? And perhaps most importantly, I hope the remake trilogy serves as an important lesson in art history for many to learn from and grow in all its controversies. With that said, I want to thank you for this conversation, Orion. I'm honored to be here with you and have this reminiscence on a game we love so dearly and explore its repercussions up to remake and the future. I think it was a great experience to hear our different stories and backgrounds related to these games, as well as finding out our own common ground when analyzing these endeavors. I hope the audience also had a great time, listening, perhaps, to new experiences and perspectives to enlighten positions they may or may not have had before. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about FF7R in the future, and we'll see each other soon. Have a good one, Orion.
Thanks, Hylian. It was a real pleasure working on this project with you. Once again, I would encourage everyone to check out Hylian's channel for that unparalleled exploration of Final Fantasy VII. I'm sure I speak for Hylian too when I say that every subscriber, every comment, every like on our channels is truly appreciated. Seeing that little red notification pop up is a bit like a flare in the night. It reminds us that we're not on our own out here. Whenever that engagement comes in, it reminds us that there's still someone out there who's interested, and it pushes us to continue. So thank you again for your support and for joining us on this reflection of Final Fantasy VII. I know there's often a temptation to romanticize the past and to hang on to the things that are still so nostalgically potent, but it's telling to me that while many games have come and gone, even those of which I greatly enjoyed, many are now firmly consigned to the past, but Final Fantasy VII is of the rare exceptions, a game that continues to inspire me. I feel incredibly fortunate to have experienced Final Fantasy VII. Not even a conveyor belt of prequels, sequels, remakes and spin-offs can change that. My memory, my experience endures. It feels a lifetime ago since I took that bus journey home, without realization of what I was about to dive into. As for the brother who I travelled into the city with all those years ago, who had and still has zero interest in story-based games, he would often ask to race chocobos at the Gold Saucer instead, so amazed by the game within the game, and I was all too happy to oblige, eager to share even a measure of the magic with him. Sometimes as he made his way around our house, I'd hear him humming the world map theme to himself. We've both grown up, moved away, we don't see each other all that often, and he doesn't play video games anymore. But from time to time, I'll send him the world map theme, and we'll share a laugh and a memory about it. Final Fantasy VII still has that kind of effect on things. I guess it's just that special kind of game.